I mean, in Honduras. And of course, I'm being facetious about it being a short answer. So.
Yeah, it's a long history, unfortunately, for the Hondurans. So the U.S. established its grip over Honduras at the beginning of the 20th century. Before that, it was in contention with British imperialism, which had established mining companies and the famous banana companies, the railroads. And eventually the US won the economic battle and military battle to, not an actual military fight, but the moving troops and forces in, and pretty much was the dominant force since the early 20th century. Honduras and Central America are considered strategic to the U.S. because of their location geographically, their narrowness and having access to both oceans in some form or the other, and a whole number of other issues. But they were really key early in the history because of the production of bananas. And so we had United Fruit and Standard Fruit were the vanguard of U.S. imperialism into Honduras. And from there, gradually they established the dominant armed force in Honduras that was able to bend or force various Honduran governments to do whatever the US said. And also they created their early alliance with a weak but existing Honduran elite to really take control of Honduras. So unfortunately for Honduras, this goes back a long time. And the US has always considered, up until early 2009, probably, that they had complete control and didn't have to do too much. They used Honduras as the staging base for the 1954 coup against Arbenz in Guatemala. They have at one time had at least 13 different kind of military facilities. That was in 2010, they had 13. But they had a long-standing military base in Palmarola going way back as part of their Cold War activities. They used Honduras as a military staging base and training camp for their counter-revolutionary interventions in Central America, starting in the late 1970s up through the 90s. And they collaborated inside Honduras. They brought Salvadoran military and the Nicaraguan Contras into the country to train and run operations. At one point, a friend of mine in Nicaragua who participated in the uprising with the Sandinistas told me that when they met people in Honduras, they did some cross-border work previous to the insurrection, and that Honduras was more repressed in many ways than Nicaragua under Somoza because of this complete domination and the weakness of the Honduran governments and any kind of sovereign force. So that they continue, obviously, to be important to the US with the rise of the ALBA countries and Venezuela. And we'll be talking a lot more about detail. But right now there's a base that has 500 permanent troops in it, and an unknown number of actual troops coming and going and training and running around the country. Also, the US is responsible for the training and vetting of a special police force that was created after the coup called the Tigres, the Tigers, which has been involved in a whole number of atrocities against civilians. And the US continually runs operations all over Honduras of training, of penetration of communities looking to do propaganda and organize their own security operations inside the country.
Thanks, Vicki. James, can you talk about Colombia, the history of Colombia and US interventions?
Well, of course, when we're talking about U.S. international relations and interventions in Latin America in general, you have to start with the Monroe Doctrine. And, the Monroe Doctrine was expressly spoken about in terms of U.S. interests, even though there was some justification for it on the basis that they were protecting Latin American countries from interventions from Europe. I mean, not a just real justification, but it was kind of squarely putting Latin America within the context of U.S. interests and U.S. control. And Simón Bolívar, who was the father of independence in Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, throughout Latin America, said a famous quote that the United States appear to be destined by Providence to plague America with misery in the name of liberty. But really, with regards to Colombia, I think we can talk about the modern history of interventions, starting with the U.S. support for Panama's independence, which was really created by the United States, that entire movement, and it was supported in order to establish the Panama Canal. So that goes back to 1903. Following that, the U.S., of course, continued to interfere in different ways in Colombia, but I think we can really go up to the World War II period. Of course, initially things were soured with Colombia after support for the Panamanian independence, but after some payments and economic involvement by World War II, relations were strong enough that Colombia actually participated in World War II, and it also participated in the Korean War. Actually, Colombia has really become something of a partner in U.S. imperialism around the world. And it has sent, you're going to have to forgive some of the background noise. There's somebody working on my cooler, and I had asked them explicitly not to come during this time. But anyway, in the Colombia participated in the U.S. war or the Korean War. It has sent troops and advisors to Iraq and to Afghanistan. And it has even sent proxy troops to places like Yemen. This relationship, though, to a large extent can be traced back to 1948, when there was a very popular center-left leader who was on the verge of being elected president, Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, who was assassinated on April 9th in 1948. And very, very many people believe that that was engineered by the CIA. And since that time, I think it's safe to say that Colombia has been a puppet government of the United States. In, ever so often they show some examples of some sort of independence. For instance, they have maintained relationships with Cuba, but in general, they are just a mouthpiece and a complete puppet. And more than a puppet, they are partners in U.S. imperialism. Today, I'll go back to something right now. Trains military, police, court, and prison personnel all over the world, tens of thousands, and at least half of the people trained have been in Mexico or in Central America. And Colombia does this training very much in concert with the United States. So if we go back to 1952, the US signed a Mutual Defense Assistance Act with Colombia. Then we lead up to the early 1960s, 1962, 2 years before the modern civil war in Colombia began. The US developed with Colombia something called Plan Lasso. And they sent down a commission from the Pentagon, which helped to enunciate what Plan Lasso would mean. And that commission, the Yarborough Commission, called on the Colombia government to use forms of terrorism, and they literally use that word. That was the word they used in the report, terrorism, and they called for the creation of paramilitaries to quell resistance and to, more than quell resistance, to depopulate areas of rural farming communities, indigenous Afro-Colombian communities, in order to open them up for private development. So that goes back to 1962. And we, of course, know that the beginning of the modern Civil War began in 1964, when the founders of what would come to be the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC, organized to resist a unilateral assault against autonomous rural areas. And so this is very much engineered by the United States. These relationships, these partnerships continued up until we reach 1999, 98, 99, 2000, and the beginning what is called Plan Colombia. And Plan Colombia was basically a funnel that has poured at least $12 billion into material aid for Colombia that has mainly been focused on the military, the police, and so-called security infrastructures. Today, in 2012, the US passed a free trade agreement with Colombia. And another thing that happened, this was under the Obama administration, but the Obama administration began a renewed relationship, military relationship with Colombia that has resulted in Colombian troops patrolling Central American air and water spaces and West African air and water spaces with the United States. And that was when it was first floated that Colombia would enter into an official partnership with NATO. And today, Colombia is the sole South or Latin American country that has this kind of partnership with NATO. Today, of course, we often hear talk about 7 military bases in Colombia that the U.S. has. The U.S. really, when it comes right down to it, I hear shifting numbers, but they have access to the entire Colombian military, and they can go where they want, whether or not we know it. And that happens. There is a constant revolving door between the Colombian military and the Southcom, the United States Southern Command. When the current president, Ivan Duque, before he was before he took office, he visited with Southcom officials and went to Florida to visit Southcom. And after he took office, that's one of the first things he did. When there was a change of personnel at Southcom, the first thing they did was go to Colombia. Most of the intervention in Colombia today takes place via the so-called war on drugs. I won't go too much more on about this right now, but I'll just say that it is an utter lie. I have traveled throughout the most rural areas of Colombia. I have seen miles and miles of coca fields in the very same place where there are heavy concentrations of Colombian, US advised Colombian troops. I've seen those troops with carrying canteen stamped USA. I mean, could you imagine the United States military carrying any piece of equipment stamped with the name of another military? You know, but the thing is, these troops coexist. They are right there where there are miles and miles and miles of coca fields, whereas there's a major route to the Pacific coast where cocaine is transported. The war on lies is a complete lie. It is only about displacing rural populations for private development and for narco trafficking control. And it is the justification for most intervention today.
Thank you, James and Vicky, for that very good explanation about the history. So the second question is, we'll start with Vicky. Can you describe the presence of the U.S. corporations and the U.S. government's role they play in Honduras?
Yes. So the there's such an interlacing of U.S. military, U.S. corporations, and U.S. government, and they're so dominant in Honduras that you have to tease them out a little bit. The U.S. government, since the beginning of the 20th century, and certainly much more starting in about 1930, tied in with the influence of the corporations at that time, the fruit companies, which were the dominant U.S. corporations in Honduras at that time. United and Standard, which became Chiquita and Dole. So there was such an interlacing, and they had such power in Honduras that's when, in fact, the history of U.S.-backed political and military coups all mushed together. Began in Honduras. And there were so many coups from the 1930s up until 1980 that it's really hard to make a list of them. And that shows the political power of the State Department and the U.S. Embassy, the U.S. government in Honduras, as well as their use of the Honduran military, in which they have these very tight relations going all the way back. The Southern Command now and the Honduran military sit together constantly. Honduran officers trained at the SOA Watch. At one point, Honduras was, I think, number 3 in the terms of countries with the most people in the School of the Americas. And the embassy, the U.S. Embassy in Honduras, Hondurans make jokes all the time that, well, if we want to do anything, we better just go over to the embassy. We better get it's a constant street joke in Honduras, not a very funny joke, but a constant street joke about the power of the US government politically inside Honduras. The corporations at present time are somewhat less visible and perhaps less important in Honduras. Chiquita, most of its banana interests went out of business after Hurricane Mitch in 1998 because of the destruction of their banana fields. There are still bananas growing in Honduras, but Chiquita closed down most of its operations. However, Dole, which is now, they claim it as a Honduran subsidiary with a separate Honduran management, but it's part of Dole, which is a US corporation, is still quite large and has many, many, many thousands of hectares, or that would be several thousand acres of pineapples, especially, and some other agribusinesses on the northern or Caribbean coast. There's about, according to registries of US businesses, there's about 124 US corporations doing business in Honduras, but they're mostly smaller, and you have various financial interests, consultants, all kinds of things, but not dominant corporations like we've seen in some other countries. The corporations that are more important in Honduras, or the businesses, are the Canadians in the mining corporations. And it's Canadian mining that is responsible for most of the international mining damage and conflict going on inside Honduras, backed up, of course, by the US government, as well as the Canadian government. But what you don't have in Honduras right now is like mega corporations from the US doing a lot of business, except for Dole. I think that the US interests in Honduras, they have economic interests, but it's more economic interests in terms of the geopolitical situation in Latin America and the importance of Honduras for them in that way, rather than the older model in Honduras of the company, as they still refer to Dole as the company, run by the misters, as they were called throughout history in Honduras. And their influence exists, but it's much less than it was. I think those are the key things.
Thanks both for those.
Sarah,
Yeah.
we have to have James answer that question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yep. Sorry.
That's okay. So James, can you describe the presence of US corporations in the government and what role they play in Colombia?
Well, it's similar in many ways to everything Vicky just said. You do have U.S. mega corporations involved in Colombia for different reasons. Definitely for oil development, other things, but it's similar. Canadian mines are particularly active in Colombia, and a similar history with Chiquita, which was the United Fruit Company. The United Fruit Company was directly responsible, funded, provided the weapons, for a famous massacre that occurred in Colombia in the 1920s, killing several thousands of workers. There's famous examples too, well, famous, among Colombia solidarity activists. Unfortunately, they're not well enough known in the general public, but you have Drummond Coal, which is based out of an area near Birmingham, Alabama, which has actually made payments to paramilitary death squads to go after union organizers. The same thing with Coca-Cola. There was a long-lasting Coca-Cola boycott that many people are still observing because of these activities. The U.S. has a lot of, U.S. and multinational corporations very involved in palm oil development throughout Colombia, and this is a major problem because palm oil plantations are bad for the environment, and they are replacing traditional agriculture. So the activity and presence of U.S. corporations is extensive, of Canadian corporations, of multinational corporations. Colombia is very rich in resources, water, especially, water. Colombia, Venezuela, Brazil are just hugely important sources of water. Again, the oil development, mining, all of that is very active. And of course, the free trade agreement that the U.S. has made with Colombia, it has been absolutely decimating for traditional Colombian agriculture. And it has reversed the situation where Colombians mainly fed themselves, where they become much more dependent on imports. And this all, of course, is backed up by U.S. government policies and U.S. government presence.
Thanks. You both talked a lot about the U.S. military involvement in both the countries. You touched on the School of the Americas. If you could talk about that a little more, just how, I know it has another name now, but how prominent they still are, although it sounds like a lot of the training actually goes on right in the country. So, and also the presence of Israeli troops in both countries. Vicky, go ahead first.
Sure. So in the School of Americas, or WHINSEC, which Western Hemispheric something for bad actors in Latin America, I don't remember the exact name anymore, had trained many Honduran army people over the years. But as you mentioned, and as I was trying to highlight before, the most important training really goes on in Honduras, but there is still continued training. For example, only 2 years ago, in 2017, after the fraudulent election, which I'll talk about later, the most recent fraudulent election of Juan Orlando Hernandez, I was on an airplane coming back to the United States from Honduras, and this airplane was full of these very young military people, men and women, all in their dress uniforms. And I was actually seated next to a young woman. So I asked her, where are you guys going? What's happening? And she said, "Oh, this is so exciting. We're going to Georgia, to Fort Benning for training." And there were probably, on that flight, I would say there were 25 military. Now, they were not going into the School of Americas per se, to like the formal long program, but she told me they were going to be there for like 6 weeks, and how exciting it was, etc. So that's just a personal experience with someone telling me they were still going to Fort Benning and there's still all kinds of training going on. The other thing I think it's important to also understand in the current situation that Juan Orlando Hernandez is a military man himself and his family. And he comes out of the group of elites that some people have called the bureaucratic elite, as opposed to the big landowning elite or the media elite. And the bureaucratic elite are politicians and military people who have risen up. So he has very strong ties inside the Honduran military, and which is very tied to the Southern Command. And the first time he got elected, it was only days after he took power in 2013, when there was all of a sudden pictures of him sitting around a table with all sorts of American military people from the Southern Command, etc. And this goes on and on and on. But the other thing I do want to make clear is that the U.S. military acts as the military, but the U.S. government and military also act through USAID projects all over Honduras. They have advisors advising all sorts of people. They have military police trainers. So the presence runs really deep and wide in Honduras. But also some allies of the U.S. with their own interests as well as supporting the U.S. are very active. I should point out that the Colombian military runs training operations and in Honduras with the Honduran military on behalf of the U.S. as well. Not to mention that the right-wing Colombian paramilitaries have also been seen, especially from 2009 to about 2012, in Honduras in the strongest resistance spots, where they were working with the Honduran paramilitaries and forces to set up more death squads. Israel is also a strong presence, and this has two things. One is that, of course, the U.S. is part of the U.S. world network of power. Therefore, they ask it to do things in Honduras. For example, Israel has acted as sort of a proxy for some U.S. military aid to Honduras, instead of the U.S. sending, for example, the sonar weapon that's used for crowd dispersal. Israel sent the sonar weapon that was set up outside the Brazilian embassy when Zelaya first got back into Honduras after the coup, and he was in refuge in the Brazilian Empire. The Israelis recently, I think it was just last year, sent a group to train the Honduran military in border control. And this actually started in 2018 with the first of the big caravans in 2017, early 2018, when the first of the big caravans started organizing of migrants leaving the country. All of a sudden, Israel officially, with pictures in the newspaper and everything, is down there training the Honduran army in border control. So Israel is a real strong presence, sometimes publicly and sometimes more clandestinely. Another aspect to the relationship with Israel, though, is also that Juan Orlando Hernandez and most of his power, a lot of his power elite, have strong ties to the right-wing evangelical movement inside Honduras, which is significant. And like many of the right-wing evangelical movements around the world, they have strong support for the Israeli government, based on their conception that there's going to be an Armageddon in the Middle East, and that will bring the second, third coming of Jesus Christ, etc. And that Israel is key for bringing on the Armageddon in the Middle East. So it's complicated, but what it means is that Juan Orlando Hernandez has political and emotional or spiritual reasons to support Israel. He was one of the governments that jumped right away to recognize the new capital of Israel being Jerusalem. He even went, like with his whole group and entourage, and did support for that move. So that's just a couple of the examples.
And as a, thanks very much. As a follow-up, we have a question from somebody, which is, can you describe the ongoing case, just a second here, ongoing case against Alvaro Uribe, and what that means for the paramilitary and police forces in Colombia? So that's obviously for James. Do you want me to say it again, or did you get that?
No, I got it.
Okay.
So I will answer that, and I will go ahead and talk about Israel and the SOA Watch too. With regards to Israel and its connection with Colombia, Israel, after the United States, is the #2 major arms and weapons supplier for Colombia. Israel has been involved in training of both military and paramilitary forces in Colombia. What I am most aware of with regards to Israel, and it wasn't, I can talk about this in detail if you want to know, not so much about Israel, but Israel, I wasn't planning so much to talk about what we call prison imperialism, but the United States has been spreading its mass incarceration model around the world. And this began in Colombia 20 years ago when the US became very involved with the prison system. And Israel has also been very involved with the Colombian prison system with giving advice and training and sharing technology. With regards to the School of the Americas Watch, I already talked a good bit about US and military presence in Colombia. And I mentioned that Colombia has become very, very important in the training internationally. A partner with the United States, I mean, direct partner with training, security, military, police forces around the world. And this goes back to like 1952, when Colombia first developed, became the location of the first America's wide counterinsurgency school in Latin America. Colombia has the largest contingent of people that have been trained at the School of the Americas, or WINSEC. It has a base in Tolemaida, which is kind of which is pretty much the South American School of the Americas. It provides training both to Colombian troops, and it provides training to troops from other places in Latin America, and much the same material that the School of the Americas provides. And I want to mention the SFAB, the Security Force Assistance Brigade, which was founded, I don't remember exactly what year, it's very recent. But we've been calling that the Mobile Global School of the Americas. It is by no means just focused on the Americas, but it is like the School of the Americas based out of Fort Benning. And it is basically a mobile squadron that goes anywhere in the world to do the same kinds of trainings that the School of the Americas would undertake. And it recently undertook its first mission in Latin America, which was to Colombia. So in regards to the issue of Uribe, the arrest of Uribe, the process going on against him, and against Alvaro Uribe, and how that has impacted the assassinations and the activities of the paramilitaries. This is something, I'll talk about in more detail a little bit later on, but it's had a huge impact. Uribe in the 1980s, I believe it was the 80s, was listed by the Defense Intelligence Agency of the United States as one of the top 100 narco traffickers in Colombia. Uribe, while he was governor of Antioquia, undertook a process which led to the foundation of the modern paramilitary death squad system in Colombia. And he has continued to be the major patron, considered the father of the modern paramilitaries. Since the arrest of Uribe, and again, I'm going to talk about this in some more detail later, but since the arrest of Uribe, the assassinations of human rights defenders and social movement leaders, especially in rural areas, especially in rural Afro-Colombian and indigenous areas, has increased yet more. And we have been seeing some of the worst massacres, just a rash of massacres. There were 3 massacres in one day in last month that left, I forget, something like 28 people dead. And this has just been escalating since Uribe's arrest. Uribe is a major opponent of the peace accords, and the killings had already escalated by enemies of the peace accords, and it has just gotten worse. And of course, Uribe is a good buddy of Donald Trump. And the Donald Trump administration has made a major effort of trying to undermine basic aspects of the peace accords, especially with regards to rural development in exchange for voluntary eradication of crops with illicit uses, rural development and crop substitution programs. Trump has pushed heavily to discontinue those in favor of just flat out forced eradication without rural development. Uribe's been a major proponent of that. The pressure from both of them has already been over the top, and with Uribe's arrest, the assault is just going all out.
All right, thank you for that. James, I'll ask you the next question since we're talking about all of this. Can you tell us more about the recent increase of assassinations in Colombia? Who's been targeted and why? And this is where you can roll in the answer about the drug trade and the drug trade and the cartels.
Okay. Yeah, pick up where I left off, directly related. Colombia has, for a long time, been the most dangerous place to be a union member in the world, been the most dangerous place to be an environmental defender. Honduras too. Honduras, I don't know, I think Colombia goes back and forth with Honduras on that level, in regards to percentages. Again, Honduras and Colombia in many ways, they're mirror images. There's with significant differences too, but it's been a dangerous place for a long time. Since the peace process began in 2012, one of the things that we saw and one of the things we expected with the peace process was that there would be an increase, that there would be a backlash. And indeed, over the course of the peace process, we saw assassinations go up, political assassinations, political killings. The peace process was implemented in late 2016. I do not remember, the statistics are changing every day, but we're talking about since 2016, something like more than 800 people have been killed, more human rights defenders, more than 200 former insurgents have been killed who had laid down their arms. So yeah, it went up. I think around the time of the peace process, if I remember correctly, the number of assassinations went up to one person being killed roughly every 3 days. The Alliance for Global Justice took a delegation 2018. It was an election delegation. It was the election which Ivan Duque was elected. He is a disciple of Alvaro Uribe, a close ally with Donald Trump, both with Bolsonaro in Brazil, many ties to paramilitaries. That campaign was marked by violent threats and assaults against leftist parties, against center leftist parties and their campaign workers and their officials. We saw irregularities in every polling place we visited. I don't believe it was a fair election whatsoever. I don't think he is legitimately elected, but when he was elected, the rate went up of assassinations to roughly one person killed every 2 days, you know. Around Christmas, around when the holidays began in 2019, the Christmas, New Year's, the holiday season, assassinations went up to a rate of roughly one person killed every day. Since Uribe has been arrested, that rate has increased again to more than one person killed every day. I already referred to the massacres that have taken place. All this is compounded, of course, by the coronavirus and the quarantines and the fact that social movement leaders and human rights defenders are easily found, more easily found than ever. There has been human rights international accompaniment has not been able to happen on anything like the scale it needs to because of the closing of the international borders. So only people that are already there have been doing any accompanying. And that has not, you know, because of travel restrictions in the country, it's been difficult. So people are basically easily found and easily killed. And the killings have not just been of these social movement leaders themselves. Entire families have been killed. Children have been killed. Babies have been killed in the arms of ex-insurgents and human rights defenders. You know, it's a truly terrible situation. And we also have a parallel too with you asked who's been victimized. Mainly, you know, not mainly, it's definitely been in urban areas too, but it's been primarily focused in rural populations, rural farming families, Afro-Indigenous communities. However, there is also a parallel with the whole issue of police brutality, very much inspired by what's going on in the United States. And I could go into detail about that. I won't, but I will say that very recently on September 9th, a lawyer and taxi driver had gone out in the wee hours of the morning, and he was basically arrested and repeatedly beaten and tasered to death while a crowd was looking on, filming this, calling for the police to back off. And his crime was that he was out after curfew. Then after that happened, the streets of Bogota were filled with protesters against police brutality. And the SMOD, which is a riot police that was created as a joint initiative of the US and Colombia via Plan Colombia, took to the streets. And before the day was done, they had killed 13 more people. So we also have this going on. We have the paramilitary violence, the violence of the military itself, and then we have police violence against protest movements that's been increasing. It's something we witnessed last year when we were there for the largest national strike that had occurred since the 1970s in November and December. So that's a quick rundown of the situation right now.
Vicky, of course, it's environmentalists are being assassinated in Honduras and targeted. Can you tell us why that's going on? Give us the names of some of the environmental groups there. And also at this, I don't know if this follows naturally, but if you can also talk about it does, it's related. An update on the caravan that just started out of Honduras a couple of days ago.
Sure. So there have been environmental struggles in Honduras over the years. I think that calling them environmentalists and environmental struggles has not always been the most common language used in Honduras. And in some ways it may be reductionist in that most of these organizations and groups, while they are environmentalists, are also tied to the struggles of the indigenous peoples for control of their territories, of the campesinos, for land rights and the ability and right to grow food in a healthy situation, and different kinds of struggles for autonomy and sovereignty over at least the regional areas. So, and that, for example, one of the most famous environmentalists to have been assassinated is Berta Cáceres, who was assassinated in March of 2016 as her organization COPIN, the Civic Council of Indigenous Peoples of Honduras, a Lencan indigenous peoples group, was heavily involved in leading a struggle of indigenous communities and indigenous campesino communities against a hydroelectric project and in defense of the river Gualcarque in Tibuca and Santa Barbara, two provinces, kind of in the mountains over both of those provinces. And Berta Cáceres was an indigenous leader, a revolutionary woman, a feminist, anti-patriarchal activist, an environmentalist, a leader of the resistance against the 2009 coup, and she had been a participant in the uprisings and the movements in El Salvador because her home territory was on the border with El Salvador. And she was quite public about her participation in the movements on the border and with the Salvadorian insurrection as well. So I bring that up to show that the environmental struggles in Honduras typically involve people like Berta or whole communities that have been in a permanent resistance over all different kinds of issues for many years. And sometimes the groups we're seeing now are newly formed, but it comes out of this history of struggles in Honduras. So right now, some of the important things going on, an important thing to understand too is that after the 2009 coup, the coup governments have increased the amount of concessions, they call them, or promises for land, contracts for exploitation and extraction of water and mining in particular. They have increased them tremendously. Shortly after the coup, one of the coup presidents, Porfirio Pepe Lobo, increased it to about 30% of the national territory. Since Juan Orlando has come up, that has increased more. Some people think that it may be as much as 60% of the national territory is involved in some kind of a concession, either to mining, hydroelectric, tourism projects on the Caribbean coast, and other kinds of concessions. So there's been a real escalation of attacks on the environment and the ability of people to live literally in Honduras, and also against the indigenous people's territorial rights and against the rural communities in general. And this has been a really sharp escalation. And that's part of why we're seeing such an increase in assassinations and threats and arrests of environmentalists as these coup years have gone on. It's accumulating more and more. Besides the case of Berta Cáceres, which continues to be, they're still fighting for justice for Berta in the courts. This week, they finally started they're kind of starting a trial against one of the few masterminds or intellectual authors, a man accused of actually planning and helped to finance the murder, and that's David Castillo. Interestingly enough, David Castillo is a graduate of West Point, going back to previous questions of military ties in Honduras. So it's now 2020 and they're only barely getting to a trial and it remains to be seen whether the trial really takes place. It keeps getting postponed and postponed and postponed. Another big group of environmentalists that are currently, half of them are in jail and another half are on their way, is the Guapanol Water Defenders. Guapanol is a municipality on the Caribbean coastal area as well. And there's a mining company that has the concession, and this is a Honduran mining company with various foreign partners working, which is a typical form. The Guapanol folks formed a committee called the Municipal Committee of Guapanol in Defense of the communal and public goods. And they're defending the Guapanol River and a whole series of rivers that provide water for tens of thousands of rural Hondurans that this mine will completely ruin, and it's already damaged the water condition. So there were 13 people, I think, who were arrested at one point. Then 10 or 11 had the charges dropped about 2 years ago because of because of public pressure and international pressure. But then last year, there's an appeal filed by the Honduran government court that won, and so now the dropping of those charges has been reversed, and they're facing the same charges over again. In addition, another group arrest warrants were issued a year ago for them from the same committee, but a different group of people. And when they turned themselves in to fight the charges, they were all immediately sent to pretrial detention first in a military controlled prison, which is a new development in Honduras since the coup. That even civil charges, you may end up in a military controlled prison if there's a political aspect to it. So they've been sitting in pretrial detention for more than a year, and now an arrest warrants have been issued against the other group that originally had charges dropped, and now they're reformatting the charges. Meanwhile, the whole group has had their charges increased from, at first their charge was what's called usurpation in Honduran law, which basically means theft or interfering with somebody else's property, whether land or anything could be usurpation. But now they've raised it to much higher felony, what we would call felony level charges against all of them. And this is also a trend in Honduran repressive law, is charges are going up all the time for what were otherwise lower level charges, especially for land rights, territorial defenders, and environmentalists. So those are two really well-known ones now. The emblematic case right this minute, because it's current too, is the disappearance of 4 Garifuna. The Garifuna are the Afro-Indigenous people on the Caribbean coast of Honduras, and their origin, it comes from folks who escaped from slave ships in the Caribbean, made their way to San Vincent, and then took part in a rebellion there when there was an attempt to impose slavery in San Vincent and conquer San Vincent. Through a whole series of resistance and fights, they ended up on the Bay Islands in Honduras, on Roatan, and then made their way to the coast. And they're a large group. They maintain their language and their culture. They were originally in the Caribbean mixed to some extent with the Arawak and the Caribe indigenous peoples. They have a very distinctive language and culture, and they're very strong. They're one of the most organized of the indigenous groups in Honduras, and very, very active in all forms of resistance. So on July 18th, armed men wearing vests from one of the police forces, the DPI, which is the Police Investigative Department, moved into one of the most famous resistance villages of the Garifuna people, Triunfo de la Cruz, on the coast near the city of Tela, for anyone who knows Honduras. They came in, they entered people's houses because people are in general staying in their homes because of the COVID shutdowns and quarantines and curfews. And they took 5 people, 4 Garifuna leaders who belong to OFRANE, the Black Fraternal Organization of Honduras, and another man who just happened to be visiting the community who was not Garifuna. And they have not been seen since. One of those men was the elected leader of what we might call the town council of Triunfo de la Cruz. And what had been going on with the Garifunas, of course, there's, as I mentioned, like all of the environmentalists, there's a whole history of resistance and protection in defending their territories from big tourist industries, land grabbers who want to plant African palm. And in Triunfo de la Cruz, there's a whole project attempting to take the coastal lands and plant African palm on it, which is an atrocity in so many different ways, but also would displace completely the Garifuna people. So the Ofrani members in Triunfo de la Cruz had been in a struggle with this company and with the Honduran government about their right to defend their lands, and had recently confronted the corporation who had sent people to tear up the mangroves protecting the coast so that they could plant palm. And they had the community had managed to stop the destruction of the mangroves. So that's like an immediate trigger for this conflict, but the real cause goes much deeper and much further. So these compañeros have now been disappeared since July 18th. And this goes on top of the fact that 19 Garifuna people had been assassinated last year, 8 of them within 1 month, between September and October of 2019, over these same kind of issues. It's slightly different in each community. They face different corporations and different projects that want to displace them, but there is an all-out assault, in fact, a campaign of terror against the Garifuna people, and part of it is very specific about the environmentalist activities. So what I'm trying to show is sort of that it's all of these things come together in terms of the resistance and in terms of the powers trying to control, and they control through violence and assassination as well as other points. I should also point out that there are 3,000 campesinos right now who have some sort of court, either charges placed against them, pending trial, in pretrial detention, or some of them are on probation from some other charges related to their occupations and recuperations of land, related to their struggles in their communities against the larger landowners and the mining corporations. So this is to give you sort of an idea of the scale of the environmental and territorial struggles that are going on in Honduras. And before I talk about the caravan, I just want to throw in about the narcos, the narco traffickers, because this is a good point. For the Garifuna people in particular, but also in some of the other struggles going on for control of territories, we've also seen the consequences of the 2009 coup. One of the consequences is that what had existed, there was some narcotics trafficking. There's no denying it. It existed in Honduras before the coup. But after the coup, as the whatever rule of law and structure, democratic structures that did exist, which were weak, as they collapsed, more and more we saw in Honduras a complete merging of narcotics traffickers, the traditional big landowning elite, and the military and police bureaucratic elite coming more and more together, so that people who had been narcotics traffickers but were laundering their money by buying lots of land or investing in the private public companies that were getting these contracts from the coup governments. The big landowners and that elite, instead of simply bribing or taking bribes to let the narcotics people use certain of their territories, they actually started cartels themselves. And Juan Orlando Hernandez's brother comes from the military political elite who started working with the narcos and making money, and then formed their own cartels. Tony Hernandez, the brother of Juan Orlando, is currently in jail in New York State because charged with running his own cartel. And he was so sure of the protection he would have from the US because his brother is president, and the protection he would have from his brother, that he even stamped his bags of cocaine with his own initials, TH. And it would be a whole other discussion to talk about what went wrong for Tony in terms of the protection. But it remains obvious that Juan Orlando Hernandez is also involved in this drug trafficking as well. And I just want to say that and point out that he continues to be protected by the United States. Everyone knows he's a drug runner, a cartel participant, and even the New York State federal prosecutor who was taking Tony's case, put Juan Orlando Hernandez in the records as CC4, co-conspirator number 4. And yet that was more than 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago, and he remains in power. So just to see that this, then I think go to the issue of the migrants, because I hope that I'm painting the picture of when we hear about the migrant caravans and the migrants fleeing Honduras, the thing we hear most often is that they're fleeing the violence. And the US media most often talks about the violence as if it were just these like gang violence, some narcos, terrible, 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 but, has nothing to do with the bigger picture. It's just this terrible thing this country is going down the tubes. But what they don't often talk about, most media, is this fact of how all of these factors of the coup d'etat, the increasing militarization of the whole country, the authoritarian dictatorship that's been established, all interlaced with narcotics traffic and criminal activity, has created the situation that the migrants are fleeing. And the solution, in fact, is political. It will never be a simple solution because all of these forces are very powerful inside Honduras, but they're also protected by and supported or propped up by the US government, even when the US government occasionally will extradite someone for drugs and jail them. So as long as these things exist, people will leave the country. And COVID has only, of course, added to the economic side of the picture. So I think it's really important to understand that. This most recent caravan, it is the same as the other caravans in that the situation is unlivable for more and more people in Honduras, and the COVID crisis and the authoritarian response to the COVID crisis by Juan Orlando Hernandez means that they've only been able legally to go out of their houses to purchase or take care of business once every 2 weeks. Most people, 70% of the people in Honduras don't have stable jobs. And more, I would say about probably 2/3 or maybe more, 4/5 of that number are people who are poor. So they're not just gig workers, they're people who have to go out every day and do something to get enough money to eat that day and for their family to have food that day. So this approach of the 2-week once every 2 weeks you can go somewhere, even if you have 3 adults in your household, it doesn't work. And people have been going out. They really have no choice. And then if they go out, they're beaten. There have been people killed also for not having a mask on by the police. Their bicycles, their motorcycles, if they have a car, the car they're in are confiscated, and it costs you hundreds, if not 1,000 or more lempira to get your property back, which is part of your livelihood. Even taxi drivers, for example, have had their cars confiscated and they can't get them back. So the situation that was already pretty unlivable, due to all the factors I mentioned, in the last few months has become more unlivable for people. So it's no surprise to anybody who's followed Honduras at all to see a new caravan approach. The timing, I know there's a lot of speculation about, did Trump organize the caravan, or is, all these things to benefit himself? And I think we can't really look at it that way. Of course, Trump and in all the different elites will always try to take advantage of anything that happens. They're going to try and turn it to their advantage. But I think a more likely, when we talk about the timing of this, is that one, it's starting to be a little cooler, not as hot in Central America for the traveling. And more importantly, maybe, is that Guatemala had just lifted its border closure with Honduras. Guatemala, there's a Central American agreement where you can cross, Central Americans can go from country to country without a visa. But that had been temporarily suspended because of COVID, and Guatemala had its border closed with Honduras. Shortly before this caravan began, they opened their border and the caravan went through Guatemala. I also want to mention they're now facing, the Mexican government has just announced that it's going to be using the public health emergency laws against the migrants, and that it can charge them with endangering or threatening other people's lives by entering Mexico without following the public health measures required by Mexico. So it's becoming more desperate than ever. And I don't know what's going to happen with these folks, but I think it's important to look at the whole picture of what is pushing them out of Honduras.
All right, thank you for that great explanation. It definitely does seem things are dire, not only in Honduras and Colombia, but I've heard reports like that where poor people of other countries have to be out in this pandemic in order to at least get some food for that day. Definitely the role of the US is very guilty in all of this. So the next question, we'll start with James. Can you describe, since there's such repression, can you describe about any resistance from the people in Colombia?
Yes, Colombia has a large, historic, and well-organized resistance in so many ways. And I don't want to problems it has, and I also don't want to discount that there are all manner of divisions and issues that they are facing right now that are very problematic. But in spite of all that, yeah, Colombia has had a large, again, well-organized, cohesive resistance that has been a part of its history from the beginning. And I would say the most important part of the Colombian resistance right now is the mass resistance in the street, the popular movements in that way. Colombia is impressive. One feature of Colombia that has always impressed me is that despite profound divisions among different groups, and in spite of sometimes some very negative splits and some irresponsible actions that some groups have taken against others, that nevertheless, when the chips are down, I've seen these movements come together again and again around a common cause. And we have recently seen, I mean, throughout the history of Colombia, the people have been able to mount large national strikes, the Mingos, which are indigenous-led activities, consultations, marches, strikes. And we were there in November for the very first day of a national strike that took place for a while, that completely, millions of people across the country participating in this, shutting down all the major cities. The national strike of at the end of last year was the largest mass movement since the 70s. It was just literally incredible. And these mass movements, they are not timid, and they are able to wrestle important changes from the Colombian government, occasionally. And they're able to maintain them sometimes just by having to go back again and again and again. There's really, really, really important. And they continue even now, even in spite of the coronavirus and everything. These mass movements continue. I want to say that another thing that I think that I have to say in regards to Colombia is that's very important is there is ideological cohesion. There is a very important historic driving role played by various groups that are rooted in Marxism and the very South American form of Marxism. And I don't think that this can be understated, because it has provided a cohesion and a common approach that is pervasive throughout labor movements and rural movements. There's also a very, very strong progressive movement, progressive being kind of similar to what we call liberals here. Not socialists, not Marxists, but definitely for having basic human rights, services provided. And, they have been able to, I mean, I honestly believe the progressive movement, the center-left coalition, actually really should have won the last election. I think it was stolen from them. But you have these strong political movements, strong political consciousnesses in different areas, Marxists, liberals, social democrats, but there is a cohesion and a discipline that I think that this gives the Colombian people. And, a collectivity that I think we have huge, important movements here, but I think sometimes our movements are hampered by this kind of ultra individualism and the lack of discipline that one does see in Colombia. And so there is a political consciousness and cohesion that cuts across many ideologies. There is a continued armed resistance. Of course, most of the members of the FARC-EP laid down arms, entered into the peace process, and are now part of a political new FARC party. Okay, that's going on. However, there were about 1,000 members of the FARC that never laid down arms. They didn't agree with the peace accords as they were laid out. There's also the existence of the ELN, the National Liberation Army, which has tried to enter into peace accords with the government, but they keep getting sabotaged in those accords. They are still have about I don't know the numbers exactly, but around 5,000 people. The number of FARC people, former members of the old FARC-EP, that have returned to the armed struggle. I think last I heard, I don't know the current numbers, but somewhere around 3,000 or so. So there's still an armed insurgency in Colombia of at least around 8,000 people. I want to emphasize here that I want to encourage people not to talk about FARC dissidents. It's very incorrect to talk about FARC dissidents for several reasons. First of all, they are not all the same. Not all the different groups that have taken up arms that are connected with the old FARC, they are not all the same organizations. I think the largest and most well-known one of them are called the New Marketalians, but they are not all the same, and it's not correct to categorize them all the same. But the other reason is they use that blanket term of FARC dissidents to blame a lot of the killings and even massacres on so-called FARC dissidents. And there are people saying regularly that FARC dissidents are involved in their main reason for existing is to fight for their piece of the pie of the drug trafficking. But I just want to say that I frequently speak to people who are social movement leaders, union leaders, campesino farmers and farming family leaders in the areas where there is the most concentration of violence, and they do not reflect what we hear in news reports, even reports coming from the left. According to them, many of the things that are attributed to the atrocities attributed to FARC dissidents are cases of false positives, where you actually have paramilitaries who have dressed up into uniforms or who have, indicated that they're members of these groups, and they're not recognized as members of these groups by anybody. And the issue of the controlling the drug trade, one has to understand that the drug trade is firmly in the hands of government representatives, politicos, and economic powers. For the most part, the FARC involvement in drug trade, past and present, has always been about taxing the narco traffickers, in places where there is no alternative for farming people but to engage in cultivation of illicit crops. So I'm just emphasizing, because there does continue to be an armed resistance in Colombia. The peace process, most of the people that left the FARC, that laid down arms, are being reincorporated into civil society, but there does continue to be an armed resistance, and we should not treat it as if it's all one thing, and we should understand that it's a very complex situation, and the news reports that we get up here about this are very confusing and frequently wrong. Oh, I just also want to say that for us here in the United States, it's vital that we defend the peace process, even if it appears that it's falling apart. It's falling apart because of U.S. Involvement. The U.S. is trying. The Trump administration has really tried to bring this process down. So a part of our political struggle is to continue defending that, and we have a lot of allies because there's a very important resistance there.
All right, thank you. Thank you, James. And then also just a reminder, if anyone has any questions or comments, please use the chat feature. And then Vicky, the same question for you. How is the resistance in Honduras?
Okay, I think that in Honduras, really everything is before and after the 2009 coup. I mean, that every Honduran you talk to, that's how they talk about everything in their lives, and that includes in the resistance. There did exist resistance movements, of course, in Honduras before 2009. There was a history in Honduras of a small but active and somewhat powerful Communist Party, powerful in the banana workers' unions, and part of the leadership of the great National General Strike of 1954. which is against the banana companies, which everyone in Honduras talks about it still as the great national general strike of 1954, in which they won some labor and land reforms. There existed this Marxist left continued and had various factions and strains that included, they organized guerrilla forces in the 1970s and early 1980s, but they were wiped out pretty quickly because of all the reasons I've talked about earlier. There also was a strong, the campesinos had campesino unions. Some of the most organized in Central America were in Honduras because it came out of the banana plantation workers style. So they were campesino unions, and they were also part of all these other activities, the Marxist movements, the non-Marxist resistance, trade union type, and there were trade union movements and student movements. They were also very active prior to the coup against the free trade agreements and Plan Puebla, Panama. So these movements always existed. And then what not strong and enormous, not as strong certainly as in parts of South America, but important in Honduras, which is a relatively small country. So smaller groups had more importance perhaps. What happened after the coup in 2009 was amazing and inspiring. This previous and long-term resistance people and their organizations, such as the Popular Bloc, the People's Committee, the People's Resistance Front, things like that, formed sort of the structure or a skeleton structure for the resistance that just exploded in 2009 from people who had never been active. People hit the streets. There were daily protests for 164 days, I think, every day from 2009 into 2010. And so then that was a sudden influx of new organizations, new people that the previous resistance, mostly left-wing, very explicitly left-wing, was able to put in place a structure to support and get it going. But it became much bigger. Also the social movements that had, such as the Lenca indigenous people, Copin, Ofrane of the Garifuna, other groups were a part of the traditional resistance. They also became a really important part of organizing the new resistance. They formed the National Front of the People's Resistance, which was amazing in terms it brought in even evangelical churches against the coup, a small group split off from the main evangelicals, all kinds of people, and they were in the streets all this time. And this included also members of Zelaya's party, the Liberal Party, which is one of the traditional two parties, sort of like the Democrats, perhaps. People who were Zelayista, as they called it, also joined this People's Front of Resistance while Zelaya was out of the country. And it was amazing. There was really a moment where people felt they were going to be able to turn back the coup, because the rejection of the coup by this organized and incredibly mass resistance was so great, but they were not able to. And part of that lies with the United States not wanting them to be able to. This resistance became more complicated as time went on, and maybe less euphoric as the difficulties increased, and also because Zelaya came back to the country through a negotiated deal with the coup people, and the resistance front was split over the question of whether it was time to form an electoral resistance party or a party of resistance in the electoral front. So there was a certain split in the resistance movement between the people who formed Libre, which is the party, Zelaya's party, and a genuine resistance party, but focused on the electoral arena. And those who call themselves refoundationists, who wanted to keep focusing on refounding and reorganizing the country and relying on the mass movements. So that happened, that started to happen, especially around 2012 is where the split really occurred, and the party was formed by Zelaya, and not only Zelaya, because it was also many of the new resistance folks went into the party, and even some of the longtime traditional and Marxist organizations and leaders went towards the electoral, believing that that would be the only way that they could overturn the coup, that the mass street resistance wasn't working, wasn't possible. So I think since then, there have been many new organizations, and the resistance has risen and in some ways reunited somewhat, although there remains this issue of electoral versus street. But beginning in 2017, especially when Juan Orlando Hernandez engineered his own re-election through electoral fraud and through an incredible maneuver, because the constitution in Honduras says you cannot be reelected, period, punto, aparte, as they say. And he managed to engineer a legal path, supposedly, for him to do that. And since then, what we've seen is there are the street protests continue. They rise up, then they go down, then they come back. The repression has intensified. New organizations have formed, anti-corruption organizations against the blatant corruption of Juan Orlando Hernandez, coalitions against the austerity and neoliberal measures. In defense, there's the Coalition in Defense of Public Health and Public Education, which includes like all the healthcare worker unions and the teachers unions. The Convergence Against Re-election, which then became the Convergence Against the Dictatorship after his re-election, which is the non-electoral and not mass organizations. It includes the more radical human rights organizations. It includes Radio Progreso and the Catholic Jesuit Resistance Center in the north. All sorts of different people. So there's been a lot of creativity, and a lot of people have really learned organizing skills and coming together, and there's a lot of fluidity in the situation. But I think one of the problems they've been facing and that they talk about is that, so there's all these different groups, they rise up, then there's a repression, political prisoners, or things happen, and people get out of the streets. At the same time, they have not been able to win in an election, and the next election coming up is next year, 2021, actually. And they'll probably try again a resistance coalition. But there's sort of, what people will tell you is that there's an uncertainty and as much unity as there is in the streets, there's a lack of unity of how to achieve their goal. Also, in some ways, their goal, right now, I would say the goal that all the groups agree on is getting rid of the narco dictatorship of Juan Orlando Hernandez. Fuera ho is the shout in everywhere. Fuera ho means get out, J-O-H, Juan Orlando Hernandez. So, but there's concern about how they can possibly bring this together. And also there's been different attempts to agree on sort of a minimal platform or program, other than Fuera ho, which is everyone agrees on that. And they've faced a lot of problems in what in Honduras they call protagonismos, different people's struggles to be the leaders of the movements, that sometimes has impeded the unity necessary. So I think the amazing thing about the resistance in Honduras is its stubbornness and its creativity, the way it just keeps reinventing and coming back. Every time that Juan Orlando and the US think that they've done away with it, they think they can buy off sections of it. It never happens. They just keep fighting. The weakness is being able to develop enough unity and a clear program of how to do it. Plus, of course, given the strength of their enemy, it's no surprise that that they have this difficulty, because the strength of the enemy of the people in Honduras is US imperialism intertwined with this violent, exploitative elite and the military of both countries. And that's a very powerful enemy. But they're in the streets. They were in the streets again last week, massively. So they're working on it. But those, I think, are some of the complexities.
Oh, what an incredible, I mean, it's inspiring and of course discouraging at the same time, but what a rich history and current history of resistance in those two countries. We could learn a lot from that. We're getting close. We've got just probably 15 minutes to go and a few more questions, but the next one, so probably should think about wrapping it up pretty soon, but let's see, Vicky. No, it's James. That's the next one, and we'll do two at the same time. For our question is talk about the attacks on Venezuela from Colombia. I think you've talked about that a little bit, but maybe a little bit more, fill in a little bit more. And then we also have a question here. Let's see here, I'll find it again. That has to do with Bolsonaro, and we're getting a lot of questions here. You see it, Kim?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead, ask that part, and then maybe you can do both at the same time.
Oh, okay. So, well, not only the attacks on Venezuela from Colombia, but what are the ties between the Colombian government and the Bolsonaro regime? And 3, can you elaborate Trump's administration's role in trying to derail the peace process?
Yes. Well, these are all very interrelated. There are many, Trump, Duque, and Bolsonaro are intimately interwoven allies in bringing the most far-right, fascistic kinds of politics and views to the entire hemisphere. The three of those especially together, and it relates to the threats against Venezuela. When we think about one of the things that the U.S. has really been developing is the ability to establish mobile bases quickly. And also the issue of border militarization is very important, with the idea of trying to cut off, blockade, and isolate Venezuela. And Colombia, Duque, Bolsonaro, Trump, they've all, they've tried their best to isolate Venezuela, to demonize Venezuela. They've said very threatening things towards the both of them at various times. And I'll just note that there was an exercise in 2017 called Amazon Log, which involved Colombian, Brazilian, and other troops. That was the largest military exercises ever. It involved troops from the US, Colombia, Brazil, and Peru. And I really believe that it was in the name of the so-called drug war again, but I really believe it was meant to be a very explicit threat to Venezuela. Colombia has been a staging and training ground for paramilitaries to go, both Colombian and Venezuelan paramilitaries, to enter into Venezuela. Several times it's happened again and again that they have tried to pull off coup attempts against the elected government in Venezuela. When I traveled to the Venezuelan border recently in La Guajira, it was the most militarized place I have ever been in. Just constant military checkpoints. I don't want to go into too much more detail because I know we're running short on time, but I've written or co-written with a friend in Mexico Eduardo Correa. He's a professor in Mexico City, but we've written a couple of articles about the possibility of direct military intervention in Colombia. And I will just say that it is recognized by many experts that the presence of a large popular movement and an armed resistance in Colombia that have said that they would defend Colombia or defend Venezuela from attack launched from Colombia has been part of what has kept this invasion from happening. A lot of people think that it's kind of crazy and wild to talk about a military invasion of Venezuela, and I'm not saying that it's going to happen or not, but I will say that when Donald Trump first brought it up, most people just like dismissed it as ridiculous, but it has become much more acceptable to talk about this. And I think we should constantly be aware of that possibility and resist it and help keep it from happening. There was one other question. I forget the third question. Oh, Donald Trump and the peace process.
Mhm.
The U.S. government and Donald Trump have particularly attacked the peace process in two ways. One is they have tried to attack the special court set up to deal with memory and truth and reconciliation, also to bring charges against people guilty of crimes against humanity. They have tried to disrupt that in several ways, including trying to run around it to extradite people to the U.S., former insurgents or current insurgents to the U.S. for different reasons, to keep them out of the peace process and the accords. This is why we don't return, for instance, Simon Trinidad, who was like the most important negotiator for the FARC. A peace negotiator, a negotiator for the release of prisoners that the FARC was holding, and he's being kept in a solitary confinement. Right, in Colorado right now, and he should have been returned as a part of the peace process. So they tried to do that. They tried to extradite people and get around and nullify that aspect of the peace process. Fortunately, they've been pretty much rebuffed at every turn recently in their attempts to do this. So that has been a losing battle for them so far. But the other way is just the prosecution of the drug war. The drug war is used to fund everything, to fund building new prisons, militarizing borders, and to fund the Colombian military and to send U.S. troops to Colombia. And the thing is, a major component of the peace process was the recognition. Look, I have traveled throughout rural Colombia, and roads are terrible. The idea of getting crops to market is a joke. That's why so many campesinos raise coca and marijuana and poppies. And there's actually an association of coca, marijuana, and poppy growers that are advocating for the peace accords and the eradication of those crops through the agreements. The agreements is that the government would fund rural development, build better roads, crop substitution programs in exchange for voluntary eradication of the crops. I'm telling you, growers are ready to give up those crops for substitutions for rural development. But the Trump administration has pushed hard for the Colombian government to back away from those accords and instead to resume spraying rural areas with a Roundup and to go in with forced eradication by, with the presence and participation of the Colombian armed forces. And this has resulted in many killings and massacres. So that is the number one way that they are trying hard to undermine the peace process. And we really need to expose that and oppose that.
Thanks. We are really running out of time here, but we need to really ask this question because even though those countries, well, they're close by actually. What should we be doing up here about the situation? Obviously, both your organizations send out alerts that well, people should sign up for your organizations, first of all, and get those alerts that come, because so much is going on. Calls can be made most every week. But in addition to that, or maybe that's the most important thing, what other kinds of things can activists in this country do on behalf of, or to get the heel of, or the boot off the throats of these two countries, or the people of these countries?
Do you want to go first, Vicky?
Or so on some of the specific cases and crises in Honduras, I would ask that people follow us, and there's information there on Facebook and on Twitter. We run, given COVID, we've had to focus a lot of our work on electronic actions and phone call actions, both to Honduran authorities to pressure them, and to US authorities and the US Embassy to pressure them. So I would ask that people follow our social media. We're in the middle of some campaigns right now on behalf of the Garifuna organization Ofrane, and against the terror campaign, and regarding the disappearance of the compañeros. Also, we're taking up pressure on the Guapanol environmentalist campaign, where people are facing new imprisonment. There's also a number of political prisoners related to the November 17th, the November 2017 election fraud, and they have trials that will be coming up in the next year. So we'll be working on that and supporting the Justice for Berta Cáceres. So there's a whole lot of different things. Follow us there. We will, again, when it's possible, be organizing human rights solidarity, and we don't just call them human rights, they're human rights solidarity delegations, to go to Honduras, to act as accompaniment and observers of the Honduran social movements, and to bring that back and do work with it in the US. So when we're able to do that again, we will be, and we'll be bringing speakers from Honduras again. So we don't have to just do Zoom webinars, but we can also actually take them around. I think it's, for us in the US, it's also important, the work around Honduras is part of our work against US militarization and intervention in all countries in Latin America. So I would ask that people follow all that activity and organize around it. Many members of the Honduran Solidarity Committee also have actions and activities. Alliance for Global Justice, of course, Code Pink, Witness for Peace Solidarity Committee, and many others, School of America's Watch, as well as many of the local collectives that are part of Honduras Solidarity Network. So those are the things I would push forward right now in terms of what can we do.
I'll just say that, first of all, when I got started in Colombia Solidarity work in earnest back in 2008, I got a lot of my education on the issue from people in Minneapolis and St. Paul. So, and I've always thought of Minneapolis to St. Paul as being a real bright spot, you know, in Latin America solidarity. So y'all are already doing a lot. Yeah, definitely. Please sign up. We have alerts going out frequently about both Colombia and Honduras and other places. Right now, we're talking about starting up a couple of ongoing campaigns around issues of the violence, the political violence. So just stay tuned for that, because things are going to be coming out. I want to mention one thing in particular, and we have raised enough money to pay for a year of rent and utilities, plus to have more to get some furniture and beds and things. We're working with a collective of people based out of Cali, the Pacific Coast region, to start the new Center for Human Rights in the Pacific region. We have 2 floors, 2 kitchens, 8 rooms, 2 big meeting spaces. We're very excited about this center. The center will give office space to some grassroots human rights defender and monitoring organizations in Cali. It will provide a space for training of human rights monitors and defenders throughout the region, throughout the Pacific Coast region, and it will provide lodging for human rights accompaniment. Right now, again, we raised enough money for the first year, but a year from now, we're going to need more money. So, help with raising cash for that would just be much appreciated. And it is also a place for people to go down and do missions of human rights accompaniment. I don't know if we're going to pull this off or not, but we're talking about trying to do a delegation of that type early next year. It'll be difficult under the current circumstances, but we're exploring that, and I hope we'll do that. And I'm really excited about this development.
Excuse me, I just wanted to do also a quick shout out to Hands Off Honduras that I didn't mention, who were on our first delegation in October of 2009 to Honduras after the coup, and participated in all those early days and continue to be part of HSN. So you all in Minneapolis, there's another organization with strong ties with the Honduran solidarity.
Kim? Well, first, we have come to the end of our time, and this has been just beyond our wildest dreams. I think it's an incredible report back and update on what's going on in those two countries and in the rest of Central America too. And because of course we can't remember everything, you can see this again actually at the WHAM Facebook page. It's been recorded, and also on the WHAM YouTube station. So watch again and share it with people, because this is just we can be sure that these two countries probably are not going to be mentioned in the upcoming debate, but nonetheless, we have our work cut out for us, and if it did come up, they pretty much agree anyway, unfortunately. So we stand in solidarity with the countries and with all the righteous people in Central America. And thank you so much for your time this morning, and Vicki, especially you for doing it on such short notice. And thanks to Emma. Kim?
Yes, I just want to say my thanks too. Go ahead and check out the chat for the many links that people have been posting for the different groups. Our committee, this Solidarity Committee of the Americas, meets every Thursday virtually. And if you want to be involved, I just left the email, so please contact us. It'd be great to have more people a part of this committee. And our SCOTA page is also on Facebook, where we can put in links. James can give us a link to his project, and perhaps we can post it in Facebook to get more people to help you out. I do appreciate both of James and Vicki being here today. It was quite informative. Actually, 2 hours went by pretty quickly. So I hope everyone's got something out of this, and let's continue the fight back against US imperialism that's invading around the world. That's all I have.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thanks. Really enjoyed it.